Welcome to this Practical Tips webinar hosted by Mosaic, where we'll be exploring social audit report equivalency and rescoring. For more than 15 years, brands and retailers across the globe have increasingly accepted third-party social compliance audits conducted for other brands as a strategy to reduce costs and combat audit fatigue. In the absence of widely accepted scoring criteria across audit protocols, this practice, often referred to as social audit equivalency, typically requires brands to define minimum acceptance criteria and establish processes to rescore and regrade supplier audits using their own compliance scoring frameworks for consistency. This approach can offer efficiencies in time, resources, and supplier engagement. However, it also introduces significant and nuanced variables that can undermine program credibility. Not all of these reports are created equal, and global brands and retailers are advised to be discerning. This webinar will provide participants with an understanding of the continued trend towards social audit equivalency. We'll explore the benefits and limitations of the equivalency process, as well as operational considerations, equipping brands and retailers with the knowledge required to responsibly integrate their practice into their programs. The process of evaluating how equivalent an external social audit program is to your own is essentially what we're referring to when we're talking about equivalent social audit report. This is done for the purpose of accepting a report in lieu of your own audit. As previously mentioned, this trend has picked up over the years, especially because it offers brands and retailers options that lower costs. It can contribute to a reduction in audit fatigue, allow companies to scale their social compliance programs, and speed up supplier onboarding, whereby they can accept an audit report done by another scheme rather than doing their own pre-sourcing audit. It can also support improving visibility and sometimes quality. Before a company jumps in to this trend and begins to accept reports from any scheme, it's always good to pause and consider what your approach to risk is, and how does audit equivalency actually support your program? As mentioned in the introduction, additional risks are brought into your social compliance program when you do open it to accept outside reports. So it's always good to consider what risks are presented in your particular company. How are there more risks to the business versus workers? For example, if your company has a social compliance audit program that is worker-centric and includes worker surveying or worker voice, what does it do to that program and the integrity of that program when you decide to integrate social compliance program audits that do not take that into consideration? There can be obvious external risks around reputation and perception from the media, peer, and employees when a program allows code of conduct audits to expand beyond their own code. And of course, investor expectations might be defining what schemes are allowed and what are not accepted. When it comes to human rights due diligence and import laws, there are punitive risks that potentially could come into play if a company accepts an audit report but does not actually receive legitimate information about what's occurring on the ground in these factories. And so by accepting that social compliance report and assuming that the non-conformances that are unrelated to critical risks mean that there are no critical risks, that company is still potentially liable for issues that are found by other means. It's always good to consider the negative as well as positive impacts of the work that we do. Social audits play a vital role in many social compliance programs for many companies. However, for some, they've become the only tool in the toolkit. This is a reminder that they shouldn't be the only tool in the toolkit. And when companies are relying on social compliance audits as the only way to understand risk in their supply chain, they will be creating a system that has many blind spots. As per this quote by Scott Nova, that can feel abrasive to many who work in this industry and yet also rings true in many contexts, unfortunately. Social auditing in practice involves giving unqualified people inadequate time to pursue an unrealistic objective they have no incentive to achieve. The purpose that we have in bringing this quote into this space is so that we can all be mindful of the intention that these programs carry with them, and that it matters how auditors are trained. It matters what we ask them to look for when they're on site. It matters how we guide them to write reports. And it matters what we do with the information that we receive from the reports that they generate. More and more, the philosophy of human rights due diligence provides new direction beyond auditing, requiring companies to estimate and validate the existence of salient risks to rights holders, workers. Therefore, we can measure the value of any activity, including social audits, by their effectiveness to identify critical labor and human rights abuses. We bring this up because, again, as we open the aperture and we bring more and more audit reports into view in supply chains, we want to consider what kind of information is coming through these reports and how does it reflect the actual issues on the ground. Now we'll take a look at what the equivalency process actually looks like. If, for example, a company comes to Mosaic and wants to work with us in understanding how they'd like to include audit report equivalency in their process, one of the first places that we begin is mapping the available programs. So when we consider what's out there, who's doing audits, what's guiding them, we've got brand audits, which are essentially your code of conduct assessments. These audits can appear in many different shapes and sizes, often guided by the priorities of that brand, sometimes evolving depending on the pressures of the public, of exposés, in response to specific issues. Then we've got certifications, such as SA 8000, RAP, ICTY, Fair Trade, for example. The certifications often help companies understand the level of maturity of their supplier, especially if it's a voluntary certification that the supplier themselves have invested in. Among multi-stakeholder initiatives and collective schemes, many of these have emerged over the years, including SMETA, BSCI, SLCP. A lot of these come forth in an effort to consolidate both the standards with which the industry is assessing these factories against, as well as the audit process, and creating some form of consistency. And there are also audits that are designed specifically for different audit firms, such as RSWA, URSA, WCA. And these bring yet another approach and perspective into the space. When considering what programs you actually want to accept, one of the first places to begin is considering and benchmarking what are the standards, indicators, and checklists that the auditors are using when they're out in the field doing those audits. When you start to map these standards against one another, you'll see that not every one of them is created equally. Some focus on different areas, and some do not touch on the same topics. It's also important to consider the auditors. What were their qualifications? What's their reputation and philosophy? There is variability, exceptional variability across the field when it comes to auditors and the way in which they do audits. A lot of this can depend on how they've been trained, how long they've been in the field, what exposure they have had to critical issues and investigating critical issues. When accepting equivalent audits, brands and retailers are a little bit more challenged in understanding exactly what training those auditors have undergone, because they do have less control over that oversight. And this connects directly with audit firm selection as well, and the allocation method. When you accept an audit report that was done through another scheme, do you have visibility into understanding who paid for that audit and who hired the audit firm? Was it a factory select? Or did a brand designate the audit firm? Considering the announcement type is also important. In certain countries, we know that an unannounced audit might be far more effective in uncovering certain critical issues than a fully announced audit. It's also important to consider the on-site time, scope, and protocols that are applied in the field. It's easy to take for granted the assumption that social compliance audit methodology is consistent across all audit firms and certifications and schemes. It's not, and it makes a big difference. This goes back to the quote offered by Scott. When auditors are tight on time and have an exceptionally long checklist to get through, they have very limited options to investigate deeper when they need to get the audit done. Understanding the reporting structure and content requirements is also important, and you might not always have visibility into this, but not everything goes into the audit report. And so the report itself tends to offer a limited view into actually what happened during the audit. Accepting equivalently reviewed reports does mean that there is a limitation in terms of your access to the full context of what occurred during that assessment. And so programs that have more prescriptive reporting structure that allows auditors to share more context tend to be more useful in gaining that type of visibility. And of course, understanding if the program has integrity and quality oversight of the auditors, of the audit process, of the reporting. Are there SOPs related to bribery? Is there a final report review process? These considerations all provide the brand or retailer with information that helps them assess whether or not they trust accepting a report through a certain scheme or firm or program. And of course, understanding the post-audit action plan requirements. So many of these programs that already exist don't necessarily have cap and remediation expectations for the suppliers. It's simply a once and done audit and then a follow-up audit to verify closure of nonconformances. Some programs, though, do have a more ongoing corrective action process. Gaining insight into that can help brands and retailers understand whether or not factories are engaging in corrective actions and how they respond to the audits. So after considering all of these points, we want to understand, how do we operationalize this within your program? One would be setting your priorities. And this is really trying to understand, what is the reason that you're considering accepting equivalent reports? Creating internal criteria for this acceptance is also incredibly important. And this relates to the first point, where when you're setting your priorities, you can consider segmentation and how you want to decide which suppliers would qualify for an equivalent report submission versus needing an actual full audit. I'll share an example of this internal criteria in the next slide. Laying out any supplemental activities to mitigate the most important gaps is vital. And again, this goes back to acknowledging that audit is not the only tool in the toolkit. Obviously, we also have training and capacity building. There can be support visits that are working on corrective action plans with factories. But also, when we're looking at risk, it's very important to understand how to assess salient risks in higher risk countries. And when a lot of reports have been received that might not show any risk associated with those salient risks, this actually might raise a red flag internally, which we'll also discuss a little bit further along. Developing a process and training staff will need to occur. And this is because we are talking about adding a different work stream to the existing social compliance program. You'll have to understand how you'll ingest these audit reports and the data within them, and how the data that is gathered is then mapped and utilized for trending or audit planning, etc. And of course, generally speaking, you'll want to be reviewing and revising this process on an ongoing basis. So within this example criteria, you can see some of the baseline requirements that this brand has set in order to ensure that their team has a standardized process for deciding who to accept an equivalent report from and in what context it's appropriate. As I mentioned previously, Every brand will have to consider how this can be operationalized as a work stream internally. Over the years, Mosaic has been working with Elm AI to streamline this particular work stream. What we found as benefits for leveraging AI in the report review includes a much larger capacity and capability to ingest multiple report formats. So for brands that want to accept basically any report, they can have it mapped against their internal standard codes of conduct and generate a corrective action plan that is in alignment with their code of conduct. So even if they do take on an equivalent report, but they wish to control the corrective action process, they can. We've also found that having AI be a part of this process has increased the speed of the review while reducing the cost. It also lends itself to accuracy as there's a reduction in human error associated with a manual review and rescore. It allows for metadata collection and trend identification and quality oversight. So we found also it's interesting how it allows us to quickly generate trends across multiple schemes and programs, as well as understanding trends across the program itself. It's easy to demonstrate progress over time or lack of progress by quickly flagging repeat findings, and has allowed a harmonization with other data sources, including SAQ surveys and worker voice surveys as well. Whether the AI is doing the report review or the report review is being conducted manually, there has to be some sort of protocol that's followed that can assess the trustworthiness and the confidence level that the reviewer has in the audit report itself. So understanding if the report passes the smell test. For example, in high-risk countries, does the report address the known salient risks that are associated with the location or the industry or profile? And how does the reviewer tell this? This is where it's vital to ensure that whatever system you're using has the ability to understand and refer to core salient risks in the country, across that specific industry, and ideally with that particular worker profile. It's also extremely important to ensure that within the criteria and the protocol, there's always an option to reject reports that you might have integrity concerns about. Having a system in place that allows you to benchmark performance of salient risk non-conformance findings is incredibly important. Again, if we go back to the human rights due diligence focus on risk and reduction of risk to workers, it's vital that companies are designing and reorienting their programs to take human rights and critical risks into account as a core focus of the social compliance audit. If you're gathering a lot of audit reports through other schemes and accepting them, equivalently reviewed, but you're unable to benchmark how those reports and the findings in those reports perform in comparison to the salient risks that are most common in those countries, then there's likely gaps in your visibility into the actual risk throughout the supply chain. Having a system that can map different programs and understand how different schemes perform is also extremely helpful, especially when you're going through the process of deciding if you'll accept, for example, SMETA reports or BSCI reports. Trend data that shares and provides you with visibility into how common salient risk issues are flagged in those particular reports can help guide your threshold of comfort in trusting the integrity of those reports, especially in high-risk countries. We hope that this webinar has been supportive to you and your process as you consider the value and also the potential concerns to bring into social audit report equivalency and rescoring. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, or if you'd like to look in more deeply into how Mosaic can support you in streamlining and expanding your program, please reach out. We'd be happy to talk.